said she was on, and I always follow.
Sorry, my apologies.
Good evening. Welcome and thank you for coming out on this less than ideal night. You're good people for doing that, and you are appreciated. We will begin tonight's program with an opening prayer by Rabbi Brian Schuldenfrei of our host congregation.
So first of all, good evening, everybody, and welcome. I think that we would all concur, since you all braved the elements, all of these religious leaders would agree that that earns you a ticket upstairs. So we can all just go home now. So I was thinking about the theme and the theme of this evening, and this the idea of reward and punishment and heaven and hell and the different perspectives of it. And so I sort of offer you not a tongue-in-cheek, but sort of you'll see a theme throughout my comments tonight, which will be reflected in this prayer. So, as the Jewish representative here, I feel compelled to sort of to represent the many lights of our tradition, or the many thoughts that our tradition would have on these particular subjects. So if I was from the early biblical authors, my prayer may be something like, may you be blessed with lengthened days through obedience to God. If I was a Pharisee, I may say, in your life there will be suffering, but life is a vestibule for the banquet hall, which is the world to come, and may you be blessed to prepare yourself accordingly. If I was an Essene, the guys who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, I may say, may you be blessed not to touch that thing over there and defile yourself, and may your soul live on. If you are a Sadducee, you may say something similar. If I was from the rabbis, I may say, may your stay in hell, Gehenna, be short, and may you rise up to heaven. If I was a Kabbalist, I may write, while your nephesh, which is one component, three components of the Jewish soul, may your nephesh and your ruach, or another component of your soul, while they may linger, may your neshama, the highest part of your soul, rise up to the heavens. And if I was a modernist or a postmodernist, I may say, and this perhaps I'll put myself in this camp, I would say, may we celebrate the varied nature of our tradition and our traditions, and all live long lives filled with goodness, and not worry too much about what comes next, because there's really only one way to find out. Amen.
Seems only fair. Introducing the rest of tonight's panel, the other esteemed members. Next to Rabbi Schuldenfrei is Dean Jihad Turk of Bayan, Claremont. Reverend Jonathan Chute, Rolling Hills United Methodist Church. Father Alexei Smith, the Archdiocese of LA. I was at a panel one time when he was introduced as representing God. Because he's always around in the interfaith world.
That's very presumptuous.
Of course. And I'm Bob Rothman, and welcome. Tonight's program is Heaven and Hell, Reward and Punishment. The idea for this came from a lady last year who suggested it to me, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. And let me encourage any of you who have ideas, please pass them on. Let me know. I'd be glad to listen to what you have to say. You have my email in the program, and I'm here afterwards, so it's easy. I learned a lot in preparing for tonight. I think you're in for a real treat, because the points of view on the subjects we will approach differ between each of the four members of the panel. So it is really, in effect, an evening of comparative religion, which we can learn a lot of specifics about how other people think. We have to begin by starting with the origin, which is the Hebrew Bible, which has, of course, the home court for most of what will come on tonight. It began there. Rabbi Schuldenfrei, God is called the creator of heaven and earth multiple times in the Bible. The only time that there is mention of actually some substance to heaven, that I'm aware of anyway, is when Elijah ascends to heaven in a flaming chariot. So actually he goes there. So whatever is there now has that plus Elijah. And I would like to, the patriarchs did not get involved in heaven and hell. They simply were buried, as was Moses, as were the matriarchs. So there was no concern in the early verses of the Bible about heaven and hell. So I'd like you to start us off with talking about how this transition was made, where it became part of the Hebrew Bible, and how much was in there.
Good. Okay, so that's the Hebrew Bible. If we had to look at the sort of like the overall message of the Hebrew Bible, it would be like in capital letters, God in charge, exclamation point. Right? That God is in charge. And the way that the Hebrew Bible speaks is in a language of immediacy. So the Hebrew Bible is concerned with how a particular person behaves at a particular time. So if you look like in the weather outside, for instance, according to the Deuteronomists, the authors of of Deuteronomy and subsequent works, they'd say we did okay because we've earned the rain, and so therefore there was this understanding that your actions led to reward, or conversely, your actions led to punishment. What the Hebrew Bible is, what's largely absent from the Hebrew Bible, though, is the understanding of an afterlife, right? Either heaven or hell, for that matter. Well, hell, it's a little bit more nuanced because there is a geographical place called hell, and if you've ever been to Jerusalem, I actually know where hell is. It's called Gehenna, and it's a little south of the old Jerusalem train station now. I'm being tongue-in-cheek, but there is a valley, the Valley of Gehenna, and there is some that would say that the scapegoat that is talked about in Leviticus, that actually this goat was sent off to this valley, to Gehenna. And so is hell a metaphysical, spiritual place, or was it actually a valley? It's a discussion. Or a valley in which there was child sacrifices, which is what the pagans used to do in that valley before the Israelites got there. So that's hell. But the Hebrew Bible doesn't really concern itself so much with an afterlife. Afterlife sort of seeps into the Hebrew Bible. You first see it, well, most prominently, the book of Daniel concludes with this idea of an afterlife or a resurrection. And what scholars theorize is that is a direct result of Greek, of sort of like Greek influence, of Hellenized influence that's sort of finding its way into Judaism, and also a direct result of anti-Semitism as was manifest through Antiochus. Remember the Hanukkah guy, the bad guy in Hanukkah? Well, Antiochus exacts hard measures against the Jewish people, and so the biblical author who pens Daniel, resurrection is an idea of individual hope. So at a time of darkness, resurrection, or something to come after, is a light. And you'll see that throughout many Jewish views. When the Jewish condition turns dark, the light of heaven sort of calls to the philosophers and to the rabbis more strongly, or is more brightly illuminated. In other words, the reality of the condition on the ground changes or helps evolve the way that the Jewish people understand, or how tightly they kind of grapple with or embrace an afterlife. So the short answer is the Hebrew Bible is really not that concerned with heaven. The Hebrew Bible is really not that concerned with hell. The Hebrew Bible is concerned with what we do in our lives, and that we recognize God is in charge. The way we know God is in charge is in the Hebrew Bible, if it rains, your crops grow and life is good, and that's a good sign. If there's a drought, if there's illness and famine, according to the biblical authors, there's a problem with your actions. But it's not so much until later on that we find a real delving into of heaven and hell.
What about Sheol? I think we should cover that while you're on the subject. Rabbi, Sheol.
To Shiloh, right, exactly. So there are these ideas of, like, there are these sort of, Shiloh, or there are these biblical concepts or hints of bad places, and so those could be left, but it's not, like, the biblical tenor is not concerned with the exception. There are look, I mean, and this is sort of Judaism in a nutshell, and in a way, like, it's hard for me to represent all of Judaism, because do you know what a cholent is? Jihad, have you ever had a cholent? No. So a cholent is a Shabbat stew, right? And so what do you do for a Shabbat stew? Well, a Shabbat stew, because you're not supposed to cook on Shabbat, so you have to slow cook everything before Shabbat. So a Shabbat stew essentially is you take everything that's in the refrigerator, you throw it into the slow cooker, and that's your cholent, right? There's barley, and there's potatoes, and there's, whatever was left over from the week, you throw it in there, and that's your cholent. And Judaism, the view of these ideas is a little bit like a cholent. There's lots of different kinds of bites and different flavors throughout, but depending on the person or the moment, you'll see there's just such wide variety. What is consistent, however, is the tenor of the Hebrew Bible, which, while there are hints of Gehenna or Shiloh or even resurrection, but it's not the overall tenor of the book. So that's a bland cholent. A bland cholent.
Okay, Father Alexei, take us forward now through the New Testament and how things were changed in that time.
Well, certainly, thank you, Bob. From a Catholic point of view, I know when I was a child in one of our parochial schools here in the Archdiocese, the nuns used to describe heaven as you would die and you would be met at these pearly gates. Why pearly? I have no idea. Pearly gates, and there you would be perhaps interrogated by St. Peter, and certainly you would be confronted with the book of everything you've done and failed to do, and then depending upon how many pluses, you either went to heaven or how many minuses you went elsewhere, right? Today, the Catholic Church views heaven as not so much as a place, but as a state of being. The Catechism writes, Catechism of the Catholic Church indicates, and I'll quote now, eternal life, heaven is eternal life with God, communion of life and love with the Trinity, and all the blessed. Heaven is a state of supreme and definitive happiness, the goal of the deepest longings of humanity. A state rather than a place. Now that works well now, but what happens when, at the end of humanity, when in Catholic belief, bodies will be reunited with souls? Certainly bodies would have to be in a place. Unless, of course, those bodies are not the same as our physical bodies, but some type of transfigured human body, such as, again, in Christian experience on Mount Tabor with the transfiguration of Christ. So what I'm trying to say is that the Catholic Church today is less definitive as to exactly what heaven is, certainly not as a place, but more as a state of being, of union with God. I'm Catholic, but I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm Greek Catholic, which means that the Catholic Church is more than the Roman Catholic Church. Catholic Church is a communion of some 23 different churches. I'm one of those churches united with Rome. And we conceive of heaven more as a Greek term called theosis. Theosis means continual growth in union with God. That growth begins in this life and certainly continues in the next. So when we're looking forward to being in heaven, to use a common phrase, for us that really means a continued growth and experience of God, growth in God and experience of God even after this life.
About hell.
Sorry?
Hell.
Hell, next topic.
We're doing heaven first. Reverend Chute, the Protestant Reformation had what effect? Then and contemporary as well, of course.
I'm not sure that the Reformation itself had an effect on the conceptions of heaven and hell. What was present in the 16th century was a fairly grim portrait of hell and a very paradise-oriented understanding of heaven. I think the Reformation contributed to some degree a notion of how you get there, or shifted the notion of how you get there, and in the intentions and hopes at their best of the Protestant reformers, the thought was that the way to heaven or the way to hell was understood as overly dependent on actions, on deeds, and that led people to sort of want to accumulate, to put it in a sort of pejorative sense, brownie points, like a point for coming out tonight in the rain. Like, well, that's good, 2 points. Plus, some of us had to drive up the hill. Some of us only had to go around the corner. We should definitely get extra points for that. And though this is, it caricatures the opponents. It caricatures those who understood a genuine kind of righteous living as the way to be in union with God. But it also, it lifts up, there are many heresies. It lifts up the heresy that we can sort of earn our way there. That we could just, on a good day, I'm good enough. Maybe on a 100-point scale, I didn't get 100, but maybe I got a 92 or an 87, and so God's grace will come along and sort of top me up and get me from that A minus, which I would report at home as an A, and get me to a solid A plus, and that would be one understanding of how do we become good enough or perfect so as to qualify for heaven. The insight of the reformers was, you didn't get an 87, you probably got an 11. Get over the notion that you're good enough to get in. You didn't qualify. You aren't there because you're charming, well-connected, good-looking, well-meaning. the only basis that anyone is welcomed into an eternity with God is because of the nature of God, which is grace. You were thinking you had to study harder for the test, and actually you may have not been very nice to other people around you because you were so interested in making your way forward. And the intention of the Protestant perspective on grace was, again, set that aside. You were never going to get in anyway. Receive the grace that God has always been trying to share with you. Get over yourself and live.
Dean Turk, the Quran, is a verse that, a section that talks about rivers of water, rivers of milk, rivers of honey, rivers of wine, abundant fruit. It's very sensual, and I can see a desert dweller really think this would be my ideal paradise to go to. How does it work in Islam? And you're going to have to talk about 72 virgins at some point, so you may as well do it now.
So it's kind of interesting coming third. In some ways, we split the difference between Judaism and Christianity on many levels, but also on this topic. The number one theme of the Quran is, as it is in the Bible, God in capital letters. It's all about God. And obedience to God and living righteous and mitzvot, right? We would call them al-amru bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, to do what is good and avoid what is wrong. So that's like the number one theme. God, and then trying to be God-like in your character and your treatment of one another. The close second is heaven and hell. So unlike in the Hebrew Bible, and even more so than in the scripture of the New Testament, the books of the New Testament, the Quran really, with great detail and in sensual description, at least of heaven, describes a hereafter in which we will be resurrected. We will stand in judgment before God on the day of judgment. It's called Yom al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection. It's also known as Yom al-Hisab, the day of accounting. And there will be a book. It will have all of your deeds in it. So very much like the Catholic conception. It's in there's 114 chapters. It's in almost every chapter. There is some reference to or hint of this theme in the Quran that, yes, it's all about God. And because justice doesn't always find its way on top in this world, there will be another world in which there will be a reckoning and the ultimate accountability. And for those who, don't quite make it, it's interesting the way that you're describing it. Is it works, good works, or is it faith alone, etc.? Islam is kind of halfway and half, half this and half that. It's faith and good works, and there's a parable, and I'll just share with you this parable of a person who comes before God on the day of judgment. And the notion is, I'll share with you two short parables. One is, and this is not from the Quran, these are from the teachings of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. So he said, on the day of judgment, there are certain things you do that are good, that count towards your good deeds, and certain things that you do that are considered counting on your scale of bad deeds. Those things that you do that's a transgression against God, God can forgive. But those things that you do in transgression against a fellow human being, God reserves the right for that person to forgive you or not. So here you are, there is this parable of a person who comes before God with a mountain of good deeds. And God says to him, or he says to God, seeing his mountain of good deeds, he says, I want to be judged according to my deeds. Look how many good deeds I have. So God says, okay. He puts his mountain of good deeds on one side of the scale. And on the other side of the scale, he doesn't put his bad deeds. He just puts the blessing of eyesight. Just that one gift that he was given by God. And all of his good deeds didn't outweigh the blessing of eyesight. Didn't show enough gratitude to God just for that one gift that he was given. And the blessing of eyesight outweighed all of his whole life work of good deeds. And seeing that with his blessed eyesight, he said, okay, I'll go in based on your grace. And so God says, okay, by my grace, enter my paradise. And there's another person who comes and says, who has a big pile of good deeds, and then God holds him to account. And then people start lining up and say, this person was backbiting against me. He takes away from his pile of good deeds and adds to his own. This person had stolen from me. This person had abused me. This person, until all of his good deeds are gone. Still the line is around the corner. People are lining up. He has no more good deeds to dispense. So they take from their scale of bad deeds and add to his until he has a mountain of bad deeds. And then he doesn't end up in paradise. I'm just cutting to the chase. Spoiler alert. And then lastly, there's a scenario in which someone is standing before God on the day of judgment, and he's complaining. He said, this person wronged me, and I want him to be held to account. And so this person A, right, who's demanding his right, is shown paradise. He's just given a glimpse of paradise. And then God asked him, with what will you purchase this? And the person is awestruck. He's dumbstruck. He has nothing to say. And then God brings that person that wronged him and said to him, forgive your brother. And then take him by his hand, and together both of you enter my paradise. The idea is that it's through humility, through faith, through compassion, through effort, and the grace of God that you end up into paradise. Now, since there is a hellfire, and we're going to get there in a little bit, not everyone is guaranteed, and it's not just a matter of faith. So if you have faith, but you're like the guy who had the whole line of people who he's mistreated in his life, it's not a guarantee by faith alone that you're going to end up in paradise. How God is going to make that judgment call, I am glad to say I am not burdened with knowing and making that determination. So I can't tell you who's going to go where, but I can tell you that the Quran says that salvation is not just for Muslims, it's for Jews, it's for Christians, it's for whoever is a believer in God, the day of judgment, and a doer of good. Anyone who fits in that broad category can attain salvation, and that's for God to decide. And I'm very glad to not have to be, it's above my pay grade. So we'll talk about hell in a little bit. Although I think we're going in the wrong trajectory. I think we could have ended on the high note, but we're going to get into the details in just a second here.
Well, all right.
Could I add something? Of course. Thank you. Because you brought this up, and I think it's important to point out that prior to the Reformation, one of the causes of the Reformation in the Christian world was the Catholic emphasis at that time of the idea of earning salvation.
Paying for it.
Paying for it, yes. Literally paying for it through indulgences, exactly. What's an indulgence? Indulgence would be something that you could, some good work you would do, or worse yet, some monetary donation that you might give for the building of St. Peter's, and they would give you a lovely piece of paper, which would be your pass and to get out of hell free card, that type of thing, okay? Well, you would be going to hell, but you'd be... Shorter time, there you go. Thanks be to God, we've seen the wisdom of the Reformation, and now our Catholic teaching certainly does not emphasize, in fact, quite clearly, when the Catholic Church and the Lutheran churches and the Methodist Church now signed down to the same document, the agreement on what does justification by faith alone mean, that we don't earn our salvation. Salvation, admittance into heaven is a result of the grace of God. We don't earn that. It's a freely given gift to us.
At the same time that indulgences were being sold, the Catholic Church was very dramatic in depicting hell. You had the Inferno, you had the artist who created the works, the paintings that showed great suffering, which of course was necessary because most of the people were illiterate, and this is the way you got the message across. You want to talk about that?
Sure. And by the way, Jihad, we would certainly concur with you that heaven is open, paradise is open to anyone who lives a just life. You certainly do not have to be Catholic to go to heaven, okay? Let's make that abundantly clear. I make that statement because just recently there is a very conservative group of nuns living in a place on the East Coast who holds on to that belief and is telling people that unless you're a Catholic, you will not go to heaven. This is not the teaching of the Catholic Church. This is not the teaching of the Catholic Church. I remember being at Milken, the Jewish school, and we were talking about the same subject, heaven and hell, and everyone was very polite to me, the priest there, and then a young guy gets up and asks me, Father, I'm a Jew, do I have to become Christian in order to get to heaven, in your opinion? And I said something to the effect, well, as a Catholic, I look forward to spending paradise with you, as a Jewish guy. And there was dead silence in the room. Absolute dead silence in the room. And one of the teachers said, Father, I don't think you realize what you just said. I said, no, I realized what I just said. I'm not so sure you realized what I just said, okay? We don't believe you must be Catholic in order to be in paradise. Back to hell.
Well, Bob, actually, I was on that exact point because although you might represent God, I don't know that the diversity that is Christianity is necessarily represented through that. Maybe the Church, the Roman Catholic, or the Catholic community, the Catholic Church, more broadly speaking, and maybe more progressive Protestant. But what's the spectrum within Protestantism, if I may, Bob, but not to derail things?
So this was a number of years ago now. I was called by the then comparative religion teacher at Peninsula High School. He said, I need you to save Christianity. And I said, tell me more. And the previous class, guest speakers from a community, religious community within our South Bay area had been present. And in this class, there were people representing diverse religious viewpoints, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, as well as Christian and non-religious. And one of the students asked their understanding of who qualified, and they basically said, unless you have a faith relationship with Jesus Christ and confess Him as your Lord and Savior, you're going to hell. And this did not warm the hearts of the participants in the class. In fact, a couple pursued it further and were clearly distraught by it, ending up in tears. And the speaker tried to make it, I guess, easier on them, kinder on them, by saying, oh, this is not my view, this is not my opinion, this is God. And that also, again, did not help. And so, no, it's a prevalent view among Christians in North America and elsewhere around the world. I'm sure all of us hold some sense in which certain people ought not be qualified. I was talking with the PV High religion class this past month, and they were asking about, they said, do you believe in hell? And I said, well, it's not a believe in kind of thing. I think I believe in the grace of God. I believe in Jesus. I don't believe in hell. And I said, it's not a main feature of my understanding of the Christian faith. Maybe it's one of the pieces in the stew. But I said, here's the thing. Wouldn't we all wish that unrighteousness, that injustice were reckoned with? The idea that people would do evil to their neighbor, to a stranger, and get away with it. Do we want that? And we agreed broadly in the room that we did not. And I said, here's the problem. If we gave everybody a buzzer in this room who could identify those who should not get in. Like, we'll just click and, we'll label them. I said, we hand these out to everybody. Is anyone left when we're done? Is anybody left? If we all set up the criteria for who we think should not make it, and in Palos Verdes, I wonder how many of us would not have been tagged by somebody. I saw that guy run a red light, with kids in the crosswalk. Click. We would eliminate, I think, almost everybody. And so we find ourselves stuck between wanting to reckon with injustice and punish evil and unrighteousness, and at the same time wondering, what about my part in that?
It's just, we done? I'm sorry. It's interesting to me that in some ways what may elevate this discussion is not elevate it. But it's almost as if we're doing sort of an autopsy on our traditions, and sort of to look in the factors or the historiography that led to the development of these different theologies, right? Because in some ways, to me, that's a more interesting discussion. Not so much, what Catholicism or Islam has to say about hell, but sort of like what leads them down, or what is the factors that result in that belief. And just as sort of a side note, sometimes as someone is one of the Jewish representatives on the Hill, it's not uncommon for high school students to come to me. I could think of several just in the past few months who've come to me and have had very painful encounters with friends of different faiths, and had been told by their friends, gosh, I like you. I really wish that you would believe a certain way so that you could go to heaven. And frankly, it was often very difficult for me personally to sort of empathize with that, because I saw the real struggle and the real pain that caused. And then recently, I listened to This American Life. Are those of you familiar with the radio chart? What's that? Ira Glass. Yeah, the Ira Glass. It's an hourly sort of delving into a story, an American story. Anyway, it dealt with, and I'm sure some of you are more familiar with this pastor named Pearson in Oklahoma, and he was a big sort of evangelical. He was a leader in the evangelical movement, and he was slated for success, and he the church, the biggest and the best and everything, and he had the episode was titled "The Heretic," and the reason for that was because he ultimately couldn't reconcile the insistence of a belief in hell with his own personal belief. And it was very interesting. He talked about a mission to Africa, where he was called in at the last moments to baptize these babies, and he couldn't if they didn't accept Jesus as their Savior, he couldn't understand how they would be, that they would essentially be damned. And you can hear the pain in his voice as he was, had to leave his church because of a theological rift. That's, what Judaism also is, we're not so dogmatic in our, the stew is intentionally spicy and varied in taste, but for where faith in a particular dogmatism plays a greater role in whatever faith you're talking about, I can imagine the pain of sort of facing off against that and saying, my gosh, I no longer believe that, and the pain of that, or the pain of encountering others who don't believe that. So
we should talk sometime. I'll tell you some of my stories of growing up in Rome, Georgia, near the buckle of the Bible Belt. I was the only Jew in my high school, and a lot of things happened that were incredibly nasty. But there were good people too, and learning to distinguish between those has been very important to me, I think. Boy, if I got stories. Anytime you want to start, I'd be glad to do it.
And that interplay, though, that Jews have for 2,000 years have essentially lived in nations, alternatively with Islamic authority or Christian authority. What you see here, they're not silos, at least for Judaism. Like Maimonides, for instance, the Rambam was greatly influenced by Islam. In fact, some of the most interesting academic articles that are published are sort of how to reconcile different Maimonides writings, because they sometimes seem to contradict one another. And one of the factors that comes in is the influence of Islam in his thought and in his development. And so you definitely see that, and as well as when heaven and hell start to take root in the rabbinic imagination post-Bible. A lot of that influence is clearly as the Christian church begins to develop its thought, and there's clear influence as well in rabbinic thought from Christianity. But what's sort of interesting is that the faiths are, when Jihad was mentioning the stories, the parable that he mentioned, there are rabbi stories that are sort of very similar, because they used to read each other's books and they used to exchange ideas, and maybe we'd be better off if that happened a little bit more.
How important is the introduction of Satan in this whole? I mean, without a bad guy and a prominent bad guy, can you develop as much theology about hell or punishment without Satan?
It's easier to have a bad guy, but it's not original. Certainly Judaism, the early forms of faith of the people of Israel, there was no Satan in the story. You don't find Satan referenced in the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament for Christians. And you might think, well, certainly the snake is in Genesis. Genesis is a late text. The prophets are the early texts. So there were faithful members of that community for centuries without any reference to a bad, an evil deity who seems to have entered Jewish and then Christian thought during the time of the Babylonian exile, and their encounter with some of the folks who were in Babylon and area at the time, and particularly the Zoroastrians, who had a very well-developed dualistic theology in which there was a good God and a bad God, and history, the living out of everyday ordinary life, was the struggle between those two poles. And humanity's role was we were invited to help the good God prevail, so our right actions were required to help win the war in the end, but the outcome was somewhat uncertain. And it's at that point that a tempter, an opposer, enters into the story and was present in that tradition around the time of the life of Jesus. So it was a part of common faith in many people's understanding at that time.
What about the Greek influence at that time?
Well, actually, I'd like to go back to your original question that I think you were going to ask me about Dante in the Inferno and Catholic conceptions of hell. Certainly, Catholics do believe in the existence of hell, and we base that on many things. Two things immediately come to mind: two of the parables of Jesus, Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus, and the Last Judgment, Matthew 25, okay? But if you've read the Inferno by Dante, he tells us of his imaginary journey into hell, his entry into the kingdom of eternal night, where he hears voices of those damned rising in some type of bestial mode, and he sees the sinners being stung by wasps and burnt by falling fire and frozen in sheets of ice, perpetual punishment and pain, okay? Physical pain. And for many, many years after he wrote that, that influenced Catholic thinking, and popular thinking particularly, as to what hell was. Catholics no longer believe in such a physical state. Rather, hell is conceived of as, a state of being in which the person suffers from an eternal deprivation of God, of not being in the presence of God. Okay, we don't take some of those passages of Revelation about the rivers of fire and all of these things literally, but maybe that's the fire of dissatisfaction with oneself for being deprived of the presence of God. And we don't believe that God sends anyone to hell, but we are our own judge there. Matthew 25. The great parable about the Last Judgment, where interestingly the parable talks about the person being confronted by Jesus and says, you know, you gave me something to drink, you gave me something to eat, you came to visit me when I was ill, you clothed me when I was naked. Come now, enter into the joys of the paradise. But you didn't do this. I was thirsty and you didn't give me anything to drink. And I was naked and you didn't clothe me, and such and such. For you, you know, depart from here into the fires of hell or whatever. Interestingly, nothing about belief there. Doesn't say you have to believe in Christ. It merely says how you acted in this world. And you are the one that is the judge of whoever you're going there. Okay? It's interesting, this evolution in Catholic thinking, certainly. Again, when I was a child in the schools here in this Archdiocese, we were taught that hell was a place that you would spend, if you ate that hot dog on Friday. Little Alexei, if you ate that hot dog on Friday, you are going to be shoveling coal for the rest of eternity in the fires of hell, you know? That's not the mentality today. It's not the mentality today. More of an emphasis on this eternal deprivation of the presence of God. And interestingly, although we definitively believe that in the existence of hell, we cannot definitively state that anyone is currently residing there. Okay?
Might be empty.
Might be empty. With the possible exception of Satan, which gets back to your original question.
That's the roost.
Yes, that's exactly. Satan is real for us. It's not imaginary. He's not imaginary, he or she. I'm not going to go there. But as an evil influence and as a personification of evil, yes, we would believe that Satan exists.
Jihad, in preparing tonight, I looked in my Quran under fire and under hell, looking for some quotes or something. And in both cases, in the index, it said it's mentioned over 200 times, much too much to be able to report in this index. So
I can list them off for you now.
Maybe just one or two.
So I get the feeling that with all the fires and that just as sensuous as heaven is described, hell is the opposite. The anguish is extreme and the punishment great. Is that still the belief, or how is that approached?
So one thing I appreciate is Rabbi Schuldenfrei's question about how this came about. And Muhammad, who was a cousin to Jesus and to Moses, descendant also of Abraham from his oldest son Ishmael, was born some 570 years after Jesus, but from the other lineage, right? From Ishmael, and the biblical prophets are the descendants of Isaac. So the Arabs, who were descendants of Ishmael, and other peoples there, some Egyptian and Yemeni, et cetera, but the Arabs generally saw themselves as descendants of Abraham. some 2,500 years before the time of Muhammad. They believed in God. They believed in God as the creator. And it says in the Quran, if you ask the Arabs, the pagan Arabs, and I'll explain that in just a second, who created the heavens and the earth, they would say God. And in Arabic, like Elohim, it's Allah, similar. Hallelujah, so there's a similar term there, cognate for God. However, the Arabs, unlike the teachings of Muhammad, believed in other deities. They were pagans. They had many idols that they crafted with their own hands, that they worshiped. They believed God had daughters, and they had all kinds of superstitious beliefs, etc. They were pagan. That's number one. Number two, they also did not believe in heaven and hell. They believed that when you died, the only thing that lived on after you was your reputation. And, which, you'd say, okay, that's not so bad, except for the fact that they thought, in their honor-shame culture, that it was honorable to have a male as your firstborn child. And if you happen to have the shame of a daughter as a firstborn, then they thought it was honorable, therefore, to go and dig a hole and bury that little girl alive, hoping that your next born will be a boy. So here comes Muhammad to these people who have this tradition that's deeply rooted, that everyone thinks is good, and he's morally outraged and saying this is abhorrent, this is egregious, this is an abomination. And they say, well, who are you to question the traditions of our forefathers? All that mattered to them was their reputation. And his response, empowered by this 200 verses referencing hellfire, a day of judgment, and heaven, by the way, as well. So a little bit of a carrot stick context, says, well, you know what? It matters because when you die, your soul then does live on. And you will be resurrected and brought back and held to account before God. And God doesn't think it's okay to bury a little girl alive. How dare you? You don't want to be in a bad situation vis-a-vis God on the day of judgment because the eternity of your soul is at stake. God is now the judge. It's a moral paradigm shift. And there's a lot of hellfire and brimstone because Muhammad only preached for 23 years before he died. He's from the age of 40 to the age of 63. 22 years of solar, because it was lunar time the lunar calendar at that time. So for 22 years he preached. And by the time of his death, all of Arabia had embraced the religion. They stopped burying female children alive. They started honoring orphans and the poor and the impoverished and the marginalized in society. He transformed the values of the entire Arabian Peninsula within that 22-year period, and it would not have been possible had the message of the Quran only been about God. I think the idea of a heaven and a hell and the very sensual or visual or visceral descriptions thereof was one of the most important tools that he was empowered with to transform society. And at the same time, I very much appreciated Father Alexei Smith's description of both heaven and hell, because it's a shared understanding. Because there are 7 heavens, we believe. The lowest heaven, the highest, and you would imagine, if everything is great and there's nothing at risk, you would get bored in heaven, right? Everything is kind of laid out for you. But our time here on this earth, from the moment that we come into this world until we take our last breath, is an opportunity for growth. And if we don't take advantage of it, we don't quite make the grade, or we didn't quite get into God's good graces and obtain salvation, then hellfire is a place in which there are levels of hell. And Dante, by the way, got a lot of his material from Islam and from the Quran, although he put Muhammad in the 6th circle of hell, but that's another story. There are levels of hellfire. Or hell. It's not all fire, by the way. It's the same kind of descriptions you would find in Dante's Inferno, which, like I said, are taken from Islamic sources, where you will face your worst demons. Like if you are selfish, it's kind of like that. You've seen that meme of people sitting around a table with these very long spoons and the soup in the middle, and they're all starving to death because the spoon is so long that they can't feed themselves, but they're around a circular table. They were long enough to be able to feed one another, but they were so greedy that that no one thought to even share with the other and hope to be fed by the other, right? So depending on what your malady is, you will face that and somehow in hell grow. And hell is not an eternal damnation according to Islamic teachings. Not in the Quran, it's kind of hinted at in the Quran, but in the prophetic traditions, there's a notion that for those who have even a mustard seed, which is a very small seed, a mustard seed of faith and goodness in their heart will eventually be purged from hell and entered into heaven, where there will be continued growth. And the highest of heaven, the seventh heaven, is when you are in closest proximity to God. And the worst part of hell is that you are far removed from God. In fact, on the day of judgment, when you're being judged, it says in the Quran, "La yukallimuhum Allah." God doesn't even look towards them or talk to them. They are removed from God, and that is the most painful part of damnation. And eventually you grow and you learn. If you didn't take advantage of it in this life, then you'll learn the hard way. But eventually you'll be purged from hellfire, entered into paradise, where you'll continue to grow in your proximity to God and the ecstasy that one experiences thereof. So all of the other things about having fruit and greenery and water and rivers and wine and milk and all of that, that's all nice and fine. And even 72 virgins, which isn't mentioned in the Quran, and it's based on a weak report of some teaching of the Prophet Muhammad. And someone who's blowing themselves up to get into heaven, they're going to have a rude awakening on the day of judgment, because that's not the way to get there. Anyway, but the real, although there are those kind of nice other things, the real prize of paradise is your being in the presence of God.
Just to piggyback on something that Jihad said,
Which is interesting, because neither Jews or Muslims eat pigs, so we're piggybacking.
This notion of hell as an opportunity for growth is also, when Judaism does delve into the conception of hell, which is not really until later, until the rabbinic period, but that it's not as big of a focus. But when the rabbis go there, most rabbis see it as also it's a purgation, that there's an opportunity for hell to be a growth experience. And some rabbis, I think it's Rabbi Akiva, who sees it as almost an essential rite of passage, that you almost have to. Has anyone ever caught there's this TV show called Ted Danson, The Good Place? Has anyone watched that TV show, The Good Place? So it's a TV show that's on right now, and it's actually brilliant. It's a brilliant show. I only saw the first parts of the first season, but essentially, without giving too much away, it is about sort of what Jihad touched on, which I think is something that is present in many of our faiths, that this opportunity that, at least in Islam and Judaism, I only speak for Judaism, but that the Gehenna is viewed as an opportunity for your soul to do growth. And that it's an opportunity. Many of you are familiar with Jews who say mourner's Kaddish. Okay, so mourner's Kaddish, the legend around mourner's Kaddish is that you are actually which doesn't mention, it's a prayer that a mourner mentions in the immediate period following someone's death, and also on the anniversary of their death. So many people come to synagogue to say Kaddish. Anyway, mourner's Kaddish actually doesn't talk anything about death. It's an affirmation of life. And so originally, mourner's Kaddish was viewed as really a testimony for the living on behalf of the deceased. And that its purpose was to help, as the soul was sort of being weighed, was to help the soul in God's eyes to be elevated. That in some ways the goodness of the person, their legacy, their spiritual legacy, was adding to their blessing. And you, by saying Kaddish, were testifying that this was a soul that is worthy of a ticket upstairs. in Judaism, that's seen, at least by some rabbis, as the role of hell, as a rite of passage. I will confess that there are other rabbis who see it as a place where you're punished, and that, again, speaking about the historiographical nature of the importance of looking at the context, the historical context of when these texts are being developed. For the Jews who were largely experiencing, especially 300-400 of the Common Era, who are experiencing intense persecution and were kicked out of their homeland and were really struggling, and through the Middle Ages, these texts that were developed were sort of like all those, the only vehicle that the Jews had were their texts. They didn't have any power. And so their power were in their texts, and they imagined quite vividly some of their enemies being subjected to great punishments in hell. And they are a little bit easier on the common Jew in terms of the ticket upstairs, the ticket ha'olam haba, to the world to come. And why? Why was the kind of like the bar perhaps lowered? I think because the historical reality was that life was very difficult, and so that the rabbis wanted to give the Jews a sense of hope and a state of despair when hope had been lost, when all power had been ceded. The rabbis sort of open the door and say, wait a second, this is bad, but hang on. If you could hang on a little longer, something better awaits. And I think in a time of great despair that was a great blessing. Whether it's true or not, again, who knows? But it is perhaps the retention of hope is the greatest blessing that we can achieve.
You may find this unusual, but you could have two Jews disagreeing with each other here in some manner. Again, having grown up in a very Christian world, even fundamentalist Christian for a large part, in my early religious schooling, I asked rabbis about heaven and hell, reward and punishment, incentives, and I was taught that the reward for living a good life is living a good life. That this is your commandment. To do right is to be normal. To do wrong is to be bad.
That's right.
And that's why in the Jewish context, there is no heaven and hell, because the concept of living a good life is the supreme concept.
Except that there is. Right? It depends on what bite of the stew that you're eating. So your rabbis gave you one bite of the stew, which is from the Mishnah, which was the Mishnah, which is one of the earliest rabbinic teachings, asked this question, like, why should you do the mitzvot? Why should you do these? Because we're a works-based religion, right? And so the problem with a works-based religion is what the point that Jonathan made earlier, which was, are we starting like a scoreboard, right? Where you think you have something, you have good works in the bank. You have mitzvot in the bank, and so you've got enough and you're going to cash in. And sort of that, the quid pro quo of reward and punishment. And so the rabbis were concerned about that. The rabbis were very concerned that a mockery of deeds, that there would be a mockery of deeds. And so what they do is they say that you shouldn't do mitzvot for the sake of reward. This is from Pirkei Avot, which is a section of the Mishnah. But rather you should do it just to be in service to God, which is the answer that Bob received at his in Hebrew school. It's one bite of the stew, it's present in our tradition. There is no, and this is what I was trying to communicate through my earlier my prayer to lead off the session, is that there's really there's so many different flavors of we're We don't get there's room for disagreement and for the rabbinic imagination, and even the postmodern rabbinic imagination, to flourish here, because we're not wildly insistent on anyone believing any one thing. In fact, the 13 principles of faith, which Maimonides pens, he says that you got to believe in X, Y, or Z, and one of those things is a resurrection. But in another place, and in his introduction to Perek Chelek of Mishnah Sanhedrin, a rabbinic work, he seems to hedge on that. And so even Maimonides is having this internal conflict, seemingly, over these ideas. And so that Bob's rabbi told him something different than I'm telling you tonight is of no surprise to me.
But one thing we could probably agree on is I saw a bumper sticker once that said, "How much bad can I do and still get into heaven?" It's not the right mindset, because that's not what I think any of us are advocating. It's more about the personal character and the growth and the proximity to God, and trying to emulate the positive qualities that would
Absolutely
bring you into God's good graces.
Absolutely. I'd like to revisit one thing I believe I heard you said, that should a person be condemned in hell, but there would be a possibility of that person exiting hell. That some of the early church fathers taught the very same thing. Origen of Alexandria, for example, whose writings I think date to the 200s, certainly taught that, and he was condemned by everyone else, but he certainly taught that. And I know that there are some Christians today who also would believe that.
And purgatory?
Purgatory is an intermediate state. Should someone have the misfortune of dying and not being in full graces, but not warranting hell, but not quite ready to enter into heaven. This is especially emphasized in the Roman Catholic Church, not so much in the Eastern Catholic Church, but in the Roman Catholic Church. There is this intermediate state where a person goes to purgatory to somehow be purged of those iniquities of which they're guilty before they are fully open to the grace of God to be entering into paradise. This is all based on a book, a Jewish book, which is no longer in your canon, Maccabees, where it states it is a holy and something thought to pray for the dead, that they might somehow be loosed from their labors. That's one of the bases for the Catholic idea of praying for the dead. And in the Greek world, we certainly believe, certainly some of the early fathers like John Chrysostom and some of those people wrote that there's entirely a possibility of such a period of purgation. It's just not so well defined. And I cannot help but comment, looking at this beautiful stained glass window, or stained glass section there you have of the tree. There is a Catholic church in this Archdiocese in Monterey Park called All Souls Church. It's to remind people there of all these souls in quote-unquote purgatory. All the windows are flames. It's an eerie place in my estimation. But that was the idea, was that in those days, the mentality of the Catholic Church was, and as we were taught in this elementary school mentality, purgatory was just like hell, only you were sure of getting out. Okay?
The Vatican changed some definition of purgatory recently. The Vatican made a recent change about purgatory.
No.
Okay, explain me.
The Vatican made a change in the idea of limbo, not the dance, but the limbo. We don't take stances on dances. Limbo was that concept, some medieval concept. Now, what would happen if a person died, a child died, for example, and was not baptized? Certainly they couldn't be condemned to hell through no fault of their own. But they weren't baptized, so could they make it to heaven? So the church, trying to define absolutely everything, said, no, they're in a place called limbo. Today we don't believe in limbo, and we believe that who enters heaven and who doesn't enter heaven is up to God, not for us to determine. That's what the Vatican was saying.
Okay, now, I'd like to hear, how important do you feel incentives are for people to be good. How important is a belief in heaven and hell, or an afterlife that has rewards and punishment? How much does that dictate their performance here? I mean, I'm sure there are some on all sides, but
I'll start, if I may. So some of you might have heard of Rumi. Rumi is a mystic poet, lived 800 years ago. And he was a Sufi, right? Someone who was in touch with the more spiritual aspect of Islamic teachings. And he describes or depicts a state of connection to God that's likened to a dove. And he said a dove is perfectly balanced between the right wing and the left wing, that it flaps to keep afloat. And he said, imagine your relationship to God, you are like a dove. You're balanced between fear of displeasing God, whether that's a fear of hell or etc., a fear of punishment or fear of your own soul or your corporal experience or whatever, or just distance from God, but fear on one side, hope in God's pleasure, in salvation, in heaven, in a menial sense or in a more elevated sense, but somehow you're balanced between those two things. But the head of the dove is love, where you are in a state of gratitude and awe and reverence for God, and that you're driven and motivated and directed in your life out of love of God and His creation. And so this is kind of the imagery or the picture that's painted by Rumi and Al-Ghazali as well in his works on thinking on this topic. So and then he further said that if hell didn't exist and heaven, if heaven didn't exist and hell were to freeze over, I would continue to devote myself to worshiping God and trying to be a good person, predicated on my love of God and gratitude. So, and then also, and I'll just two other little points. Muhammad, when he was towards the end of his life, he was, 60s back then was living a long time. So he was 63 years old, his ankles were swelling, and he was standing, doing an all-night prayer vigil, and his wife said, Muhammad, why are you pushing yourself so hard in devotion to God? You're already guaranteed paradise. And he turned to her and he said, shouldn't I at least then be grateful? And so, that was, in terms of motivation, that was it. And at the very beginning of his preaching, this is probably the second revelation, and I'm just going to share with you, and this will be I know we're running out of time, so this will be my conclusionary comment. I'll share with you a little bit of the flavor. I'll recite the Arabic. But this is probably the second revelation that he received when he began his mission, preaching to the Arabs in Arabia, the pagan Arabs. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والضحى والليل إذا سجى ما ودعك ربك وما قلى وللآخرة خير لك من الأولى ولسوف يعطيك ربك فترضى ألم يجدك يتيما فآوى ووجدك ضالا فهدى ووجدك عائلا فأغنى فأما اليتيم فلا تقهر وأما السائل فلا تنهر وأما بنعمة ربك فحدث. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, consider the bright morning hours and the night when it grows still and dark. Your Lord has not forsaken you, O Muhammad, nor does He scorn you. For indeed the life to come will be better for you than this earlier part of your life. And indeed, in time, your Lord will grant you what your heart desires, and you will be well pleased. Has he not found you an orphan and given you shelter? And found thee lost on thy way and guided thee, and found thee in want and given thee sufficiency? Therefore, the orphan you should not ever wrong, and him that seeks thy help you should never chide. And of the sustainers or the Lord's blessings you shall ever speak. So here, and this is repeated in the stories of Moses in the Quran, and Moses' story is told in the Quran, and Jesus and other prophetic figures, that they are tasked with going and making a difference in society. And as part of their communication from God to them when giving them this burdensome task is to remind them of the blessings that they received when in the earlier parts of their life, and sustaining them throughout. And so there is this sense of gratitude that's the foundation, and a sense of hope that things will eventually be at peace and at ease, whether that's in heaven or close proximity to God. And I think it's fulfilling for the human character. It gives one something to look forward to. It can really help the human condition to have the knowledge that God is in charge, that the injustices that we see in this world will eventually be put right, that as long as you give it your best effort, that you try your best, that when you pass away from this life and you're good with God, that you will find God as you imagine him, loving and compassionate and merciful and gracious. This is kind of the heart and core of Muslim belief, and it's something that I find very reassuring just as an individual, and something that inspires me to go out and try my best to do. I don't quite get there, but this, when I'm at a lower point, this is what I draw upon to find inspiration.
What's the surah?
This is chapter, it's called the Early Morning Light, and it's chapter number 93. Chapter 93 of the Quran. There are 114 chapters. This one is one of the short ones. Some of them are quite long, but this is a very short one. That was the entirety of the chapter.
Rob, you were asking what role does motivation play? And I've had this conversation any number of times with people over the years. If God's grace is there for all, if God's love is available to all, if we don't have to qualify, if we don't have to score 87 or 92 on the test, why be good? Why bother? What's the point if I'm in the same place in terms of salvation as somebody who's not good? Why be good? And the answer that I've tried to say in response to that is, if we believe that the universe in God's grace is ultimately headed toward a future in which forgiveness and peace and joy, compassion, humility come together, then the purpose of living rightly in this life is not so much to get into heaven later as to bring those values which we believe are eternal into the present moment now. It's sort of like, well, you could wait and get into heaven, or you could have the experience in the theological term is proleptic, that you could have a taste of it, a glimpse of it now. Why wait till you die when, in a gesture of compassion, in an act of humility, in living in a just or righteous way when that might be costly to you, you're actually participating in the core meaning and value of the universe. I went years ago, maybe in adolescence, I went looking for the scriptures because I was curious about heaven and hell, and I wanted to sort of create my own map of those places so that I could understand them better, and I found that I was defeated in the purpose. If you go through the index and look for heaven, you will find that most of the references in Scripture to heaven are about the sky. It's talking about the rain falling from heaven. It doesn't mean, it's not, there's no detailed description, a map 3D of the different levels and the features of each level. And much the same was true for hell. There are stories, and they come at it in small ways from different angles, and in some sense they illuminate something. The story of rich man and Lazarus, as you mentioned, a story which actually first shows up in Egypt, pre-Christian, pre-Judaism, but Jesus tells it and uses it to make a point. Well, it sounds as though there is reward and there is punishment, and it sounds as though it's kind of instant and immediate. And then you have the story of Jesus with the thief on the cross, and after he says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom," Jesus says to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise, today." And then you have the Matthew 25 text, one of my favorites, in which it says, at the end of time, when all the nations are gathered, there will be this judgment and this sorting. And you sort of ask, well, which is it? Is it now, or is it at the end of time? Well, it kind of depends on which story you want to consult. And I feel as though God did not provide us in Scripture with that map, with that multi-layered, three-dimensional picture of it. And I wonder if that isn't because God doesn't want us to have too much of a handle on these things. That if we are left in the mystery, if we are left in a place of humility, then when we are left wondering, we're in a better place than when we think of ourselves as the enforcers of the sheriffs of a plan that we believe we completely understand.
Realized eschatology, now but not yet, type of thing. Yeah, absolutely. I would concur with you in that. I think for myself, Genesis, the book of Genesis tells us we are born in the image of God, and we believe we are called then to grow into that likeness. That growth begins in this life, and it will be certainly enhanced and completed in the next. The motivation aspect there is that we would continue to grow. And we continue we were taught in grammar school, again, this is all before the Second Vatican Council, we were taught all about God, but we were never taught to know God, never to have that type of relationship. That was something you people did. Protestants had personal relationship with Jesus. We knew all about him, but we had no relationship with him. Thanks be to God, that's all changed now. It's all changed, and this idea of knowing God, becoming intimate with him to the best of our ability in this life, that might be continued in the next.
Well, I think we've gone far enough in time. Thank you all. Be sure to join us February 10th at the Rolling Hills United Methodist Church. Rabbi Ron Schulman, who many of you know quite well, is going to talk about what the Bible and beyond, meaning other writings, talk about and teach us about how to disagree civilly and appropriately so that we can get some kind of inner peace with this.